So energetic connectivity, intuition we're going to cover. Really, if I had to give a word for the theme today, it's really interconnectivity. So set that up. I've come to learn that a lot of you are already familiar with HeartMath and our work, which is great. For those of you that aren't, here's sort of a kind of condensed mission statement, which is basically to facilitate a fundamental shift in health, well-being, and consciousness. Being a psychophysiologist, I need to kind of preface things here by saying that most in my field, especially me, could care less about most brain waves these days, like how much alpha rhythm somebody has or beta, these types of things. What we've really come to understand in recent years is that what really underlies consciousness, or the little consciousness, if I can use that, awareness consciousness, brain level consciousness, is the brain's ability to synchronize and organize its own electrical activity. So really what we're more interested in is synchronization, harmony, more than how much of a certain thing. Does that make sense? So that's going to be kind of a theme as well. Another high-level concept I wanted to share is it's really the emotions, our emotions that run the show. So I get a little bit tired of hearing all about cognition, and you know, I'm on a mission, I guess, to kind of undo the standard cognitive model. If there's any clinical psychologists, I apologize in advance. I think the model is upside down, which basically says that emotions are a result of cognitive processes. Change our thinking, we change our feeling, you know, and our behavior. ABC model. Yeah, there's elements of it that are true, but it's incomplete. Because in reality, it's the emotions that come first, in most cases, and actually run the show. And if we're looking from a psychophysiological perspective, or especially a physiological perspective, you can be I can do tasks in the laboratory, have you wired up, and you can be thinking, and I can give you math problems, and all kinds of stuff. Very little actually happens in terms of your physiology. But I get you mad, right? I get you in a state of deep appreciation. A lot happens very rapidly and profoundly in your body. See where my drift? It's emotions that run the show. Okay? In terms of what drives, the primary drivers of our hormonal system, the activity in our nervous system, the effects on the immune system, and so on. And it's really the emotions that also determine what we care about in life, what motivate us, why we do the things we do. Make sense? Okay? So enough said. Again, that's a whole hour lecture. For those that don't really think that emotions run the show, well, here's a demonstration. So in stress research, which is often done with animals, you know, your little mice and rodents and so on, one of the common ways that you cause a stressor in that little creature is called restraint stress. You don't have to hurt them. You don't have to shock them and all this, actually. You just restrain them. Very stressful. So here's human restraint stress, with the husband seatbelted into the car, having an argument with his wife. Get the humor, right? Real data, actually. So we do a lot of real-world data. So he's a passenger in this case, seatbelted in the car, so there's no physical activity here. Right out of his log, his real log, wife said something that got under his skin. That's where he got triggered. And we see his heart rate's up at around 140 for about a half hour. I happen to know this person. I guarantee you he could not maintain that heart rate through physical exercise for that long. It's true, absolutely true. So you get, so anyway, even after they made up over here, we can see his heart rate stays up. That actually goes on for about an hour and a half. And that's very typical. After even a brief kind of emotionally driven stressor, we get mad at somebody, we get irritated, impatient, and so on. Profound changes that have long-lasting effects, actually. Make sense? So I just wanted to kind of preface this because it's kind of important, because as it turns out, emotions are going to be a theme here as well. So heart-brain communication will be our next kind of mini topic. We're talking about how the heart and the brain communicate with each other. And through 30 years of doing this kind of research, I've certainly come to the perspective that the heart plays a central role in psychophysiology, especially in optimal function. So we work a lot now with athletes, professional athletes, Olympic athletes, to really maximize their performance. And of course, optimal function is a big subject. a lot of ways you can talk about it, but you have to consider the heart when you're really looking about optimal function. I'll touch on that a little bit. But the heart is basically the most powerful generator and consistent generator of rhythmic patterns, information in our body. There's no question of that. And it's in communication through multiple pathways. So it actually integrates a lot of different systems in a very unique way. It's very unique to the heart. So neurologically, we'll talk a little bit more in depth about that. Biochemically, the heart, for example, was reclassified in the mid-1980s to be part of the hormonal system. It secretes hormones, not just responds to them, manufactures and secretes them. One that's commonly, the first one to be discovered is now called Atrial Peptide, ANF, ANP, for having biochemists in the audience. Nicknamed the balance hormone. This is how it kind of became nickname. Then were discovered catecholamines, things like dopamine or epinephrine and so on that the heart produces. Most recently, a few years back now, it was discovered the heart also manufactures and secretes oxytocin. Some of you may know that hormone. Media likes to call it the love hormone, so how appropriate that the heart produces it. In fact, the heart produces as much oxytocin as the brain. So it's one of the central places for it. So biochemically, biophysically, the pressure waves generated by the heart squeeze and influence every cell in the body. And energetically, the heart is by far the biggest player, which we'll talk more about as well. Okay, so let's focus a little bit more on the nervous system aspect, the neurological. The heart and brain are really communicated through the nervous system via what's called the autonomic nervous system. And the autonomic system is what regulates over 95% of our intrinsic processes, things we don't think about. Heart rate, digestion, has a large regulatory role in hormonal activity, also immune activity. So it's very high up in the hierarchy, if you want to think of it that way. The two different branches, sympathetic and parasympathetic. And I'm going to grossly oversimplify things here. So you can think of the sympathetic as the accelerator pedal. When more signals are going down it, that speeds up heart rate, tells the adrenal glands to secrete adrenaline and so on. Parasympathetic, more like the brakes, slows things down. Okay. Again, way too oversimplified. But both branches are always active. And they're two literal separate systems. And hopefully they work together in some type of coordinated activity or harmony. Sometimes they don't. The heart, however, is in the center of things here, quite literally. The heart is another thing that's unique about the heart is it's autorhythmic, beats on its own. In fact, it's the only organ that's really been identified that has true pacemaker cells within the heart itself. However, it is innervated or connected to both branches of the nervous systems. So any change in the activity, increased or decreased in either branch, affects the way the heart beats on what's called a beat-to-beat basis. That's just kind of some background for where we're going. Now, in more recent years, we now know that the heart actually has its own intrinsic nervous system, technically called the intrinsic cardiac nervous system, nicknamed the brain and the heart or the heart brain. Okay, that's not me. I can't take credit for that. There's a whole new field now called Neurocardiology, and there are neurocardiology centers all over the world, actually, quite a few here in the US. And these are basically neurologists / cardiologists that are really studying the intrinsic cardiac nervous system for a lot of important reasons. Again, it's a whole lecture in its own right that I won't go into. Now, this next statement will be surprising to a lot of people, and that is that the heart actually sends far more information upstairs to the brain in our head than the other way around. Well, the heart's got a lot more going up here than the brain has going down to the heart. Okay? Sound like some new discovery? No. It's been known since the late 1800s. The early people mapping out the autonomic pathways knew this and discussed it, many, many years ago. Only it just got ignored and forgotten and kind of buried away. And it must not be important what the body's doing. After all, the body's there to carry the head around, right? Kind of thinking. Well, that actually was the thinking. Now, here's where it gets more interesting, and that is that the signals the heart sends upstairs to the brain centers involved in things like our ability to think clearly, decision making, our reaction times, coordination are all profoundly affected by what's going on in the heart and the heart brain. Okay, make sense so far? So there's a constant two-way dialogue going on between the heart and the brain. This is probably a little complex, but this is an accurate wiring diagram. Most textbooks are still wrong, medical textbooks, of the way this is all laid out. The main point here, in fact, if we look at the parasympathetic branch, the vagus nerves, two very large nerves, thousands of fibers in each one, 95% of those nerve fibers are carrying information from the body to the brain. 95%. So only 5 to 10% are actually brain down to body. It's not a close competition. It's a big difference between the information flow. So the nervous system in the heart, what we do know now is that it actually makes its own decisions, and it overrides the inputs coming down from the brain. It's a good thing. No, it really is, physiologically speaking. If you got really angry and you were kept sympathetic drive, the heart, you would give yourself a heart attack. If something didn't have the intelligence to say, no, hold the phone here, and override those signals at a very practical kind of level. So, okay. I'm originally from Missouri. You know, our state tagline is a show me state. So, here's some photographs of or microscopic photographs of the intrinsic cardiac nervous system. This is from a human heart. So these globs you see here are basically what are called ganglia. And ganglia is just a term given to a group of functional neurons that are wired together in a functional way found outside of the brain. If these same groups of neurons are up here in the head, it could be the core of the nucleus, the core nucleus of the amygdala, or all kinds of different brain centers, same thing. At this level of magnification, the main thing is to see that they're interconnected, wired together, so to speak. Now we'll blow in another level of magnification on one of these ganglia. So each one of these round little things here is a neuron. Now these neurons have been using the same techniques used to show long and short-term memory in neurons in our head up here, like hippocampal neurons, have been used to show that these neurons in the heart also have both short and long-term memory. And I'm not suggesting that the neurons in the heart are designed, or their purpose is to remember what grandma's face looked like. But it's important that the heart has functional memory. Doesn't mean that they can't also have other types of memory. In fact, there's a lot of evidence they do. Okay, so if we if we go cut through here, slice this in half and look inside, this is what it looks like inside of a intrinsic cardiac ganglia. So these are what are called dendritic fields, all the interconnections between the neurons. So we know that using the same type of techniques that are used in neurology in the head, that the ganglia in the heart have neuroplasticity. They change their circuits and functions, and so on. Okay, they actually look like little brains. You know, if you go back an image. But now this is the distribution of the ganglia in the heart. So this is the heart-brain part. This whole series of these ganglia, again, all interconnected and wired together. Okay, and then there's about 40,000 of these guys in the heart. These are sensory neurons, which again have been known since long 1800s and so on. So it's been known for many, many years that the heart had neurons that sense pressure, called baroreceptors in the old language. As it turns out, only about 20% of the neurons, these sensory neurons in the heart, are pressure sensitive. The other 80%, and this is new, are sensitive to chemistry, biochemistry. So if you wanted to have a nervous system monitoring what the biochemistry of the blood was, what's going on in terms of the changes in the blood, in terms of our hormones and neurotransmitters, where would you put that sensory system? Doesn't the heart make sense for us to have that? Yeah, so that's exactly what's going on. And that information is processed in the intrinsic cardiac nervous system and sent upstairs to the brain sometimes. And it also looks like they're sensitive to other types of things like magnetic fields. Okay, so all this activity between the heart and the brain, what has proven to be a very useful and convenient way to understand the dynamics is a thing called heart rate variability. Is that a term familiar to any of you, most of you, none of you? Okay, a little background here then. So heart rate, we all know what that is, right? Just how many times the heart beats in a minute, the average of, okay. In reality, our heart rate is changing with each and every heartbeat. Okay? Now that's exactly opposite of what doctors used to be taught. It used to be thought that a sign of good health was a steady heart rhythm. You know, the time between each beat was the same. Unless we did some exercise, you know, climb the stairs or whatever, and the heart rate would kind of slowly change. Absolutely wrong. In fact, in a healthy individual, healthy, resilient person, we have more of this beat-to-beat variability than if we have less of it. Kind of a long story short. So what we do is we measure the time between each beat. Okay, and then you say, okay, well, the beats per minute equivalent, just so our brains can think about it, for this beat would have been about, what, 65 if all the beats were the same, right? And you measure the time between the next. Those are a little bit closer together, a little faster, so that's up a little over 70. Over here, more time between it, so that heartbeat equivalent was, what, 55 or so. Anyway, then you connect the dots, and that's what creates the heart's rhythm. Make sense? Everybody with me? Okay. All right, so this, as it turns out, this heart rate variability is kind of important. We have more of it when we're young, and it gets less as we age. In fact, we can hook you up in the lab and tell with about 2 years how old you are just by looking at your HRV. Okay, if you're on a normal, healthy aging trajectory. If, right? Right? It's also considered a literal measure of resilience. Okay, our ability to adapt to stress, to adapt to changing life circumstances. The more variability we have, the better, the more adaptable we are. It's also directly correlated with mental functions. If you take two people the same age, they should have more or less the same range amount of variability. If one has higher variability, that the person with more HRV, is what's called heart rate variability, will tend to do better on tests involving cognitive functions. We think better, make better decisions, faster reaction times. So there's a causal relationship. Okay? And that's been verified in lots of studies. Okay. So back here, here we're looking at a few seconds, about 25 seconds of data. Now here we're looking at a few minutes of data. And these two graphs are from the same person. Okay? And this is a very controlled kind of laboratory setup. So there's no physical activity going on here. And we used to have a lot of fun figuring out new ways to induce emotional states in people. Because we had to get pretty creative. Because you do something once, they're on to you, and you got to come up with a whole new approach. Anyway, this is very typical. This is very representative of what you see. We've done this with, well, now thousands of people. So same person. Here we got them frustrated. Okay, that's sort of obvious, that's frustration. And what happens is the heart rhythm pattern becomes much more chaotic looking. See what I'm talking about? Kind of, right? Disordered, kind of like an earthquake kind of thing. Okay, what that's reflecting is that the activity between the two branches of the nervous system, back to the sympathetic and parasympathetic, are out of sync. Okay, a good analogy for this is it's like driving your car, got one foot on the accelerator, and your other foot's on the brake. Right? So if you ever taught your kids how to drive, that's one of the first things, get your foot off the, because we keep wanting to have our foot on the brake, right? Or at least have it there. Now, why is that not a good idea to drive your car that way? You have to participate now. You burn out the brakes, okay, right? More stress, drivetrain, brakes, all that physical stuff. What else, though?
You won't get anywhere.
Well, you might get somewhere. I mean, unless you, I'm not talking about jam, but what else?
You could lose control of the car.
Lose control, yeah, and I'm looking for something else.
Waste gas.
What?
Not efficient.
Not efficient. What about your gas mileage? Exactly. You're burning a lot of extra energy, a lot of extra wear and tear there. So you're really rapidly draining our resilience, our energy. Again, that's a whole other hour lecture to give that context, but that's really what's going on. Ever notice how you're really mad at somebody about, it might feel good while you're angry, you got your adrenaline going and all that, but how do you feel about a half hour later? Drained, right. Yeah, so it rapidly drinks our energy. Okay, so there's a lot more I could say about that, but you kind of get the idea. Remember the heart's sending more upstairs than the other way around? Okay, so that's the signal hitting the brain. We'll talk about more about that. But basically that inhibits brain function. And that goes, actually there's a long history and hundreds of publications on this topic. It goes back to the 1970s. And the term given to this effect back in the 1970s was cortical inhibition. Cortex inhibited, basically. Okay? So same person. But you got to do something to shift from here to here, by the way. Right? And we have a lot of techniques that help people do that. Right? So here, basically here we activated a feeling of appreciation in our group. And what you see is the rhythm is very different. And we call this incoherent, by the way, and we call this a coherent rhythm. Okay. So here you've got good high variability. You want lots of this variability. So there's a range. This is somebody in their mid-30s. So you can see it's varying from about 60 up to 80 on average, about 20 beats per minute. And that's pretty typical for somebody in their 30s. Most people are really surprised just sitting down and looking at their heart rhythm, how much variability is really going on just sitting there. So somebody in their 30s, it'd be about like this. If we're getting up in our 60s and 70s, it'd be about half that range, because of that natural decline in variability, of interflexibility. So here the two branches of the nervous system are in sync. They're in harmony. This is sort of an optimal state. So this is also the signal being sent up to the brain. And it facilitates cognitive and mental functions. Okay, making sense here so far? So it's pretty cool, actually, that we now have, I'm not going to go into all this, but we now have the ability through a little bit more refined pattern analysis. And the key here isn't how much variability so much as the pattern, the information. So using just heart rate variability with about 75% accuracy now, we can tell what somebody's feeling. Far greater, from a single measure, far greater accuracy than you can get from any other physiological measure that I know of, or I think anybody knows of. EEGs and brain waves and all that, you can't even get close to that kind of accuracy. So in other words, it's not, I mean, we can actually discriminate frustration from anger, from anxiety, and so on by looking at the pattern. Now, so incoherence and coherence, this is kind of a gross pattern. I mean, you've really shifted into a fundamentally different physiological state when you're in a coherent state. And I need to, let's see, I think I might have another slide on this. But I want to make the point, let's all bring it up in it again, that coherence is an optimal state, but it is not the same thing as relaxation. Okay, so we're really talking about self-regulating, ultimately is where I'm going to be going with this. I'll give you a heads up. How do we self-regulate our own thoughts and emotions from a more intelligent inner reference point? Really what HeartMath tools and techniques are about. And coherence is a key to that. But you don't necessarily get there through relaxation. Okay, I'll give you so you can be in either of these patterns at almost any heart rate. So relaxation, by definition, is a low heart rate, increase in parasympathetic activity, all that. So you can be at a low heart rate and be in this pattern, right? So you could be overlooking the ocean, beautiful sunset or sunrise, and sitting there just rehashing the argument you had earlier that day. Should have said, darn it, next time I will say. Anybody ever done that? You relax physiologically, right? Right. Or you can be in an activated state, like an athlete or a policeman or somebody in the fire department. You got to have a high heart rate. You got to take care of business. But you can be coherent. Make sense?
That's the athlete that's in the zone, isn't it?
Well, sort of. I mean, I usually don't put it quite that way, but yeah, it's the physiology of it underlies the experience that you would call flow or the zone and so on. Okay, so here's an example of what I'm saying here. So relaxation, you actually have a decrease in the state-specific decrease in the variability, whereas in coherence there's an increase in it. These are called power spectrums. And you can see the difference here between relaxation, 150 versus 700. Radically different thing. Basically, when you're in a coherent state, it's, again, I'm not going into all the detail here today, but the physiology is we're in our resonant frequency. Okay, so there actually is a resonant frequency in the human physiology between the heart and brain. It's 0.1 hertz is the center of the bell curve for most humans. And it's really interesting, we share the same resonant frequency with many animals. And I would have not expected that because of the scale difference. I mean, cats, dogs, mice, monkeys all have the same resonant frequency, even though we're radically different sizes and shapes. But when we are in a coherent state, we are operating at our resonant frequency, which is why there's such a much bigger peak here at that frequency. So physiologically, I kind of mentioned that coherence is not the same as relaxation, nor is it the same as relaxed state psychologically necessarily. Okay, so I'll just be honest, a lot of relaxation and even meditation, not all meditation techniques, are basically disassociation techniques. Zone out. To get in a coherent state, you have to feel something. Be connected with others, actually appreciating, caring, compassionate. Those are the emotions that naturally drive us into coherence. Okay? So that's why I say a lot of people who are longtime meditators, oh, coherence, no problem. Hook themselves up to the equipment and they're not coherent. It actually is a harder time for some of them to unlearn all what they've trained their physiology into than somebody who's new to it. Okay, 'cause especially if it's the kind where we disassociate. Okay, make sense? Hope I hit a resonant chord here. Okay, so I talked earlier about all this stuff going upstairs to the brain. And I'm not going to show you all the neurological maps, but these afferents, or ascending pathways, are connected to almost all the major brain centers. It's a very complicated flow, this upward information. I'll cover a couple of them here. One is to the thalamus. And the thalamus is at the very core of our brain, kind of like onions wrapped around it. It's the way the brain's really organized in layers. Thalamus has many roles: sensory information distribution, and so on. But one of its important roles is it is the center that literally synchronizes the electrical activity of all the neurons in our cortex. It's been known for a long time. This is fundamental knowledge in neuroscience. So if you've got an incoherent pattern and very complex volleys of neural information going upstairs from the heart, impinging on the thalamus, it's a very strong and direct neural pathway to the thalamus. One synapse away, I like to say, from the brainstem. That's the pattern that's hitting the thalamus. And basically, that interferes with or inhibits the thalamus's ability to synchronize the electrical activity of the entire brain. So it's a global inhibitory effect. The easiest way to measure it, been done in labs all over the world, including ours, is a test of our reaction times, coordination tasks, and so on. Easy to show that when we're in this desynchronized or incoherent state, we don't perform as well. Okay, easy to do. However, that's not the part of the brain that's most profoundly affected. Motor strips and so on, reaction, coordination, and so on. It's part up here in the front of our head, right? The frontal, prefrontal cortex. The gift that really gives us, from my perspective anyway, is what's called foresight. The ability to understand how the actions I take now affect the future, which is different than hindsight, all the limbic memory type circuits, which are basically hindsight focused. The hippocampal and all that are all hindsight. So a lot of functions come out of that. Planning, goal setting, discrimination of appropriate behavior, abstract thinking are all prefrontal, frontal cortex. So those skills, those abilities require a greater degree of synchronized activity to really perform optimally. Right? So we get in this incoherent state, right? Desynchronize the nervous system. Guess what gets taken offline first? Those very skills. Let me give a practical example. Not that any of you in here have ever done this. Here it comes, right? Yeah, I got you. Okay, you're in dialogue with maybe your spouse, kids, especially if you have teenagers. I survived the teenagers. Mine's 26 now. Anyway. And they say or do something that frankly just pisses you off a little bit. And in that moment after that, you say or do something that you regret. About 30 seconds later, you're going, oh shit, can't believe I just said that or did that. Nobody's ever done that, right? How many of you have done it more than once with the same person around the same issue? Be honest, come on. Right, so we do the stupid thing. I mean, I can say it a couple of ways. It's why anger makes us stupid. All right, or I can be more elegant and say it's why an otherwise very intelligent individual can make an inefficient choice when they're emotionally upset. But I like to tell things like they are. Anyway, if we're able to shift into a coherent state, then that is facilitating neural synchronization of the entire brain. So we're actually able to perform better than even our normal walking around day-to-day state. In fact, it's about a 37 millisecond difference on average in reaction times. It may not sound like a lot. It's huge. If you're a baseball fan, for example, you walk up to the plate, you're doing a technique to get yourself coherent. The pitcher throws the ball at 90 miles an hour. If you've gotten yourself into a coherent state as you walk up to the plate, you will literally perceive it as though it was thrown at 80 miles an hour. Okay? There have been a number of world records set by athletes who've learned how to get into a coherent state. You know. Swimming, all kinds of things. Okay? So coherence is a good thing. Put it that way. Lots of research now, independent of us, has kind of supported, actually shown causal relationships between physiological coherence, this heart coherent state, and improved cognitive functions. Everything from test scores on taking tests to long-term, short-term memory, focus, so on and so on. Anyway, I won't belabor that. Okay, another important brain center that has direct neural connections from these afferent pathways or ascending, simpler language, is the amygdala, or amygdalas, there's two of them, obviously. In fact, the core nucleus of the amygdala is literally synchronized to the cardiac cycle, to the heartbeat. So every time the heart beats, about 8 milliseconds later, the core nucleus of the amygdala fires in unison with it. Okay? So one of the jobs the amygdala has is eavesdropping on the flow of all sensory information up into the thalamus and first sensory perception and all that stuff, and looking for pattern matches. But it's also doing the same thing for the body's internal systems, looking for pattern recognition, basically what it's doing. I'm really oversimplifying this. And this goes back to really the first, and I think it's still most elegant theory, actually Carl Pribram, whose real passion was trying to understand emotion. He also came up with the holographic perception theory, which most people don't have a clue of understanding what he's really talking about there. But anyway, independent of that, his theory of emotion, goes back to 1970 actually, said that the brain is basically a pattern recognition system, is really what it gets down to. Most of the neurons are involved in pattern recognition of the external sensory world, which is true. So the amygdala and its other associated circuitry, other limbic circuitry, is basically monitoring the internal rhythms. And almost a direct quote from his insight back then was the heart, being the primary source of rhythmic pattern information, is a primary player in emotional experience. Now also synapsing into the brain in exactly the same neural centers as the afferents from the heart are the 40-some neurons that are monitoring the facial expressions. The afferent neurons in our face are all sending signals into exactly the same place that the ones coming up from the heart are. So those are the two main players of inputting patterns into the amygdala that it's basically recognizing. And then you got the higher brain stuff labeling what the feeling is. Okay, so basically part two of the theory goes that where we tend to hang out a lot, the rhythms and patterns that the brain is exposed to, these circuits, you develop in the neural architecture familiar baseline reference patterns. Okay? So once you have a familiar established, that is what we experience as comfortable. Okay? So then what the brain is constantly doing is looking for the degree of match or mismatch between the familiar baseline pattern and what's going on right now, the current. Hope I'm making sense. This is really a much more elegant thing than I can describe here. But so it's a mismatch that gets our attention, especially. You're usually not aware of your heart rate until your heart rate gets really high or something. There's a significant mismatch. Then it grabs our attention. We become aware of it. Okay? So this has a lot of implications. So what if you develop an incoherent pattern as your baseline reference? Okay, any of you in an environment where kids are just running crazy? Right? It seems like nothing you can do to kind of, right? Creating chaos everywhere they go. I mean, you know adults like that. Yeah, come on. All right. So if their baseline pattern has become one of worry, anxiety, impatience, whatever, here's the key, that what they have to be doing to feel comfortable.
They're comfortable.
To feel comfortable. That's really the essence of what's called a maladapted pattern. Once I really understood this, it really opened up a whole new world of compassion for me. They really can't help it. They're having to act out, having to do that to feel comfortable. Okay? It also means there is no such thing as sustained change in our behaviors, in our worldview, whatever, without a shift in baseline. Okay? And these baselines exist at a literal physiological level and psychological pattern level as well. They can be measured. The coherence, as it turns out, is a rapid way of helping to extinguish old patterns and establish new ones. But that's a whole other story. Here's some examples of shifting baseline patterns. This is from a study done, a pretty large study done in high school students, 10th grade students. There's a study funded by the U.S. Department of Education. About 1,000 students participated in the overall study, a pretty big study. And as part of it, we took portable labs into these large high schools and actually measured students. And I won't go into the whole protocol, it's not relevant here, but one part of the protocol was measuring their resting baseline. Okay, they're just sitting there at the table, waiting for the bus. Not using any kind of tools, techniques, just hanging out, waiting for the bus. So this is an example of 2 students in the experimental school that represent the findings of the study as a whole. So this is not cherry-picked data. Then this is the same thing, measuring their baselines 3 months later, 4 months later, after the program was over. It was a program taught through the English teachers and so on in the school. Lots of practice and so on. What we see now is that the students have increased their variability, basically meaning that translates to increased resilience, but it's also a more coherent pattern. Okay, they're not doing anything. They have established a new baseline. Now that correlated with all kinds of other measures, observational measures, psychophysiological measures, and so on. Reduced anxiety, less fighting, all kinds of stuff. Also correlated with increased test scores. In fact, the amount of change in their baseline incoherence to coherence predicted future test scores. Okay, so baselines can be changed, and that can be measured. And without it, kind of a hard time shifting long-held behavioral patterns. Okay, I don't know how I'm doing on time here, but I'm going to shift into another topic, intuition. One of my favorite topics these days. Call this the electrophysiology of intuition because it's pretty hardcore, rigorous science where we're measuring brain waves and heart and skin conductance and a bunch of other physiological measures as well in the lab. And before I go into that particular, kind of the outcome of that data, I want to just make a few comments on intuition. Because I find it's a word that gets used kind of non-specifically to mean a lot of things, so it ends up being confusing. So I kind of look at it like there's at least 3 primary types of intuition that are all very real. So the first and the most common, especially in academic circles, in fact 98% probably of papers on intuition and the 30-some books that I've seen on it all talk about intuition is reduced to this circle, implicit knowledge. And if you're not familiar with that term, all that means is that we learned something and forgot we learned it or didn't know we learned it. Anyway, it's stored away in the unconscious neurons and all that. And anyway, it's implicit. So we got this problem. We're kind of letting it soak, and we're in the shower, not thinking about it, and suddenly this information arises from the unconscious to the conscious, and the insight, intuition, the flash of intuition. Okay, and almost all the current academic writings are arguing over what type of pattern recognition process is involved in that. Okay, implicit knowledge. Real, very real, and very important, the way the brain works. However, to limit intuition to that is, I think, a huge mistake. So another type, which we're going to look at some data on, I call energetic sensitivity. So this is the type of intuition where we're actually sensitive to real energetic things. Like it could be another person's energetic field. It could be changes in the Earth's fields, like people that sense an earthquake coming. Animals are a great example of this, that all run away before the typhoons hit and so on. Okay? Then the third category we call non-local intuition. And this is the kind that you can't explain by something I learned in the past and forgot I learned it, or kind of this more local energetic sensitivity type thing. Okay? So
Give me an example.
I'm going to show you lots of examples coming up. Thank you. Good question. Okay, so basically the result, I will get to it, I promise. of this and a lot of other studies, we're not the only group doing this, that have all kind of come to the same conclusion. That sometimes if a future event is emotionally relevant, and that is a key word, emotionally relevant. Okay, in other words, it's important to us, our security or somebody we care about emotionally. The heart produces a signal, and I mean heart literally, that alerts us before the event takes place. Okay? So basically, what I like to call it, there's an intuitive intelligence that reacts faster than the mind can perceive and bypasses the standard thought processes. Okay? Now I'll show you some actual data. We borrowed this protocol, original protocol, from a guy named Dean Radin. A lot of you probably know Dean's work at IONS. Good friend. Anyway, he shares, I won't tell you the whole story, but it's kind of a fun story. Basically, it's a process, if you remember back to the picture I showed, where you're setting a subject setting a computer, you're monitoring all these physiological measures, brain waves and hearts and skin conductance and so on. So you record the data, you got a blank screen for 6 seconds. Then at the end of that 6-second period, the computer then randomly selects a photograph that it shows to you. And the photos can be one of two extreme opposites of pictures that are designed to create emotional responses. On the one end, we've got really yucky things. It's a nice scientific word for you. Stake striking, car accidents, bad guy with a knife at a woman's throat, things like this. About as edgy as we can make them and still feel okay about people seeing them. Right? On the other end, you've got flower pots and bunny rabbits and nature scenes and really nice stuff, okay? So anyway, you see the picture for 3 seconds and you do that a bunch of times. So here's what our data look like. First, I'm going to take you through the story. So here's the skin conductance data. This is what Dean Radin had done all his work on, was skin conductance. So if the future picture is a negative one, that's this purple line, you see a nice big stress response after you see the picture. And if it's a calm one, like the bunny rabbits, you see, everything's okay. We expected to see a significant difference in what I call the pre-stimulus period in skin conductance. That's what Dean Radin had found. Okay, we did not see that. We were not happy campers. Hundreds of hours have gone into this. It takes a long time to hook 30 people up to all this equipment and measure all this stuff. And we did it twice. Once in a coherent state and once in a normal state. Hundreds of hours. We have failed to duplicate his findings. So I'm just going to give you a little bit some insight into the real story here. Anyway, then the next part of our data analysis plan was to look at the heart data, which we then did a couple weeks later. That's the blue and the red lines. This is the HRV data, heart rate variability. Red line is if the future picture is a negative one. Okay? Blue is if it's a calm one. Huge effect. Right? Zero is where they saw the picture. This is happening 5 some seconds before they saw the picture. Highly significant. In fact, the statistics were higher, way higher in statistical significance, and Dean found it on his stuff. So at this point, true story, we actually made us send a slide kind of like this up to Dean and said, hey, Dean, here's what we're finding. And he hadn't published any of his results at this point either. And he goes, oh, by the way, I think I forgot to mention, we screen out anybody with experience with meditation or self-regulation because they don't have a skin conductance response. Dean? Would have been nice to have said that. We screened 4 people who had that because we wanted to be able to be in a coherent state in one of our conditions. Anyway, that explained that. And we went on to explain why, actually. Anyway, so the HRV was highly predictive of the future event. All right, now here we're looking at the EEG data, and these are called cortical evoked potentials for those of you that might mean something to you. So 0 now over here is where they saw the picture. So this is all pre-stimulus. Okay, in the first place we see anything in the brain, just a second, where there is a significant measurable effect pre-stimulus is right here. Okay, in the emotional trials. And that's actually happening after the heart rhythms diverged, if you look carefully. Right, you had a quick question?
Yeah, my question was on the previous slide, where it appeared that there was an anticipation of the event before the event took place.
Well, sure, you're pushing a button. There's always an anticipation effect.
What led to the negative versus positive effect before they saw the picture?
Oh, well, good question. That is the question, isn't it?
Yes.
Okay, let's hold that for a little bit. Okay, so Anyway, this is the EEG now. We're looking at, all right, so we basically did it. I'm not going to show you all this data because I don't have time. We did another thing using what's called heartbeat evoked potentials. And in that period between where the heart rhythms shifted, right here, and you saw the first change in the EEG, the brain level signals, we're able to show quite rigorously, actually, that the heart was literally sending a different neurological signal to the brain, measurably, okay, and modulating, especially the frontal cortical areas, but other brain centers as well. So here's the bottom line of this. So wherever this comes from, however it works, fair enough to say that where the heart rhythms diverge is when the heart knew it? Is that a fair statement? I think it is. Okay, now if we overlay the first place in the brain that we see a measurable effect, which actually happens to be one of the prefrontal cortex sites, and this is the evoked potential. And if the brain could talk to itself, kind of can, I guess, it would be saying to itself, this big negative going wave, something important might happen. I don't know what it is. That's this negative going wave. It's a classic measure of attention. The positive shift is the aha. The information's here. Okay, this is classic interpretation of these evoked potentials. That happens a full second and a half after the heart shifted, and this is exactly the period I was talking about where there's a measurable change in the neural traffic going to the brain, the signals. Okay? Follow me? Now, I can't tell you. I have my ideas on how this works. Okay, so there are some issues with that type of a protocol. This has been duplicated a number of times now, by the way. So we developed another protocol. I won't go into all the details. It's actually using roulette, a gambling paradigm, where you bet on red or black. Not everybody responds to the same photograph in the same way, and so on. Yes, ma'am?
You said the brain is talking to the brain. Is that what you really mean, or the mind?
Well, I'm just using mind-brain together right now, if I may. Right now I'm talking brain because we're measuring brain waves. But anyway, the heart knew it before the brain did. Whether you want to call it mind or brain, whatever, heart first. So basically using this protocol, it gives us a couple of pre-stimulus periods. This is actually data here from a group who went through this particular protocol 8 times on 8 different occasions to look at how stable, are some people really more intuitive than others? And is it consistent and stable? And the answer is yes, by the way. But basically here we're seeing pre-stimulus effects. And the last data, it was about 6 seconds before. Here it's 20-some seconds. So really the experimental paradigm is what's controlling how soon before the event do you see a measurable response. And in study after study, and in this protocol of ours has been duplicated now, I think 4 times in different types of populations. Same results. The HRV is always by far the best predictor, better than skin conductance and any of the other measures. In fact, if we do some things called factor analysis, we can predict with about 80% accuracy what the future event's going to be by looking at the physiology, especially at the heart. It's pretty good odds if you're going to Las Vegas. Okay, so kind of the conclusion of all this. It's basically when we're heart-centered and coherent, this is my interpretation anyway, we have a closer alignment with our deeper source of intuitive intelligence and what has been called throughout history or millennia the energetic or the spiritual heart. Right? So I would say that the mystics have been right all along. It is the common theme in every major religion that one of my friends is a study of all these type of religions planet. And the idea of the heart being the primary access point to wisdom, to spiritual influx, right? To our deeper core emotions is common to every major religion on the planet, according to him. And certainly, in fact, the earliest reference to the actual word heart intelligence that I've found, which is a very big theme at heart math, is in some of the Islamic texts, where they actually use the term heart intelligence. It's about 1,000 years ago. So we can't say we invented it, but we certainly are really serious about it. Yes?
Is it really the heart?
Just a minute. Hold on. Darmas?
Is it the heart organ that they're talking about, or the heart chakra, or the heart energy? And then more recently, for the first time, I read that the Thymus Gland plays a very important role, maybe even a more important one than the heart.
Yeah, I'm not going to buy it, sorry. If you look at there's 2 hearts, the physical heart and the energetic heart. And it's the energetic heart that I'm really talking about here. That's why I called it that. So I'm getting ahead of myself, but I'll answer your question. And it's the energetic heart is the primary, not the only, but the primary conduit or radio signal between our higher self or large or whatever you want to call it, spirit, soul. Every culture has their word for it.
And does the thymus play any role in the energetic heart?
I don't believe so. Everything does. It's all connected. Everything is connected. But I'm saying the primary conduit is the heart, the energetic heart, which couples down into the physical heart as well. But it's the energetic levels where the real activity is. This is the kind of stuff we're starting to be able to tease apart and measure now a little bit. Okay, so basically, the data I didn't show you was that when we're in a coherent state before you go through that protocol, we have a much greater degree of access to that intuitive information. Okay? Tighter coupling, if you will. So basically, there's an increased flow of intuitive information. It's communicated, just to answer your question, via the emotional energetic system to the mind-brain systems, resulting in a stronger connection with our inner voice, right? Okay? All right, so anyway, the practice of heart coherence offers an increased access to the largely untapped potential that we have to solve a lot of the problems we have. I've kind of started out by saying, really, if you look at almost any problem, at least the way I look at it, in society, it fundamentally traces back to a problem in people's ability to self-regulate, to stay in charge of themselves, to self-regulate from a more intelligent inner reference point, right? To make better choices, basically. Okay, so I'm going to shift gears now into another domain here. In answer to the question you asked earlier, in that energetic sensitivity part of my three bubbles there. So research basically conducted in our laboratory has really shown that, especially when we're in a heart coherent state, that the heart radiates a more coherent electromagnetic signal into the environment, and that can be detected and actually affect the nervous systems of other people, animals, and so on. So when you put electrodes across the body, measuring the electrocardiogram, why is it called the electrocardiogram? What are we measuring? Electricity, right? A current flow, basically. So whenever you have a current flow, you also create a magnetic field. So when you put electrodes across the body, you're measuring the current flow, the electrical part. The magnetic part takes a different kind of instrument to measure, called a magnetometer, right? Not complicated, but the one thing about human tissues is that they're transparent to magnetic fields. Remember the experiment in probably, I don't know, 8th, 9th grade where you got to dump the iron filings out on the glass plate and you put the magnet under it and they all jump into alignment. You can put your hand between the magnet and the glass plate. It still works if you have a strong enough magnet. Magnetic fields go right through our tissues. So the magnetic fields generated inside the body radiate external. And this is what they look like. This is literal. It's not the right orientation because it's hard to see them. The shape, the magnetic field of the heart is a toroidal shape. It's actually at a 45-degree angle. It's the real axis. In fact, it's really amazing. I've got a textbook in my lab where this was accurately measured in 1886, I think, with the right shape and everything, the toroidal shape. I mean, using very primitive equipment compared to what we have now. It's a pretty strong field. With today's equipment, what they're called squid-based magnetometers, you can measure the cardiac field about 3 feet away, just under 3 feet. Now, nobody does that in practice because you want to get as close as you can to have a high signal noise strength. But you can measure a brain wave about an inch away before you lose the ability to detect it. Just to give you kind of an idea of the difference. So I'm not talking about an aura here. I'm not saying auras aren't real. I'm just saying that's not what I'm talking about. In this case, it's a very real, measurable field with any kind of magnetometer. You can measure them every time the heart beats. There's a magnetic field. Okay, now if you do analysis of these fields, you find that there's information modulated in these fields, very much like a radio transmitter, like a TV or radio wave. Once you create what's called the carrier wave, it takes a lot of energy to create that, but it takes very little energy to modulate it to impart information on it. It's kind of the same thing by analogy of what's going on here, how our emotions are modulating these fields. So when you measure them, this is actual real data from the magnetic fields, you see that this is when we're angry, frustrated, incoherent, whatever, this is the field structure, and this is what it looks like when we're in a coherent state. So it's not, I'm not really trying to make the point one's good or bad here. The point is they're different, and they map, they co-vary with their emotional state. Okay, so most people have had the experience, right? You walk into a friend's house, and you sort of sense something was amiss. Sure enough, you find out they had a phone call with some bad, some bad news or whatever. Most had that experience. And some people it feels really good to be around. So we're starting to kind of understand now that these are measurable things. So here's some practical examples of it. So here's Josh and Mabel. Josh is my son. So he was 12 years old when this picture was taken, and we did this. He's 26 now. Looks a lot different, right? But being family members made them automatic research subjects. Don't have to worry about IRBs and these kinds of things. Kid, get over to the lab and bring your dog. So what we did, experiments. So we hooked up synchronized recorders that measure the heart rate variability, one on Mabel and one on Josh. So Mabel's in a lab here, and her heart rate's all over the place, rhythm, because she's excited, she's exploring. It's normally off limits, so she's sniffing around, having a good time. So Josh is instructed, put the recorder on him. Okay, Josh, go in the other room with Mabel. Sit down in the corner, be quiet. Do not interact with Mabel, do not pet her. Do not talk to her. Just go sit down and do what we call a heart lock-in, one of the techniques. Shift into a coherent state and actually feel and send appreciation and care to Mabel. So here's where he did that. He went in, and here's where he shifted into a coherent state. Luckily for him, he better know how to do this stuff. Right? But look what happened to Mabel. Remember, he is not touching her. He is not doing anything. It's an energetic transfer here. So there's dog coherence. And dogs actually reflect their rhythms, reflect their emotions very, very closely, just like they do in humans, by the way. Okay, so here's another type. Same thing in horses. So in this case, here's Ellen. Now, same experiment I just described, only it's in a corral. No physical interaction, touching anything like that. So here's the horse's HRV, and here's Ellen. So she shifted into her heart lock-in. And you can see a pretty dramatic state shift in the horse's heart rhythm pattern. So here's what horse coherence looks like. Now, this was an experiment that worked better than it should have. We did it with, the first time we did it was with 4 horse-human pairs. 3 of the 4 actually had almost identical shifts, the horses, when the humans shifted into the coherent state. I mean, things just don't usually work that well. And the one that didn't, what I found out later, was that the 4th horse who didn't shift, just looked the same the whole time, was well known for not wanting anything to do with humans. Very standoffish kind of horse, leave me alone, get out of my face. So he didn't have that connection. Okay, here's a different type of experiment between mother and baby. So on the top, we're looking at mom's brain waves. Now it's a technique called signal averaging. I saw the presentation this morning, you used a similar thing. And the bottom is the baby's heartbeat. So it's not going to look like a normal EEG. This is the signal average waveform. And what you see here, basically, again, it's an energetic experiment. There's no physical contact between the mom and the infant. Is that you see mom's brain waves synchronizing to the baby's heartbeat when mom pays attention to the baby. Okay? If you distract mom, she's off thinking about something else, that goes away. Yes?
This is non-locality, right? You're not saying that the electromagnetic wave propagates through space and affects the other. It's non-local, right?
This I can't say is non-local because they were in a close enough environment that it could be explained through local.
But still, electromagnetic stuff can go into...
Well, I agree. I'm going to show you an example of non-local in a minute that I know is non-local. But they're close enough that there are measurable fields interactions, so I can't claim non-locality. But what was really interesting, it's modulated by mom's attention. Okay? So it's not just, Anyway, all right, now here's 2 adults, 5 feet apart using signal averaging. Now here they're several feet farther apart than a $50,000 magnetometer can measure the heart field. So we're getting closer to non-locality now. Okay? So in this case, the red line is Dan, the guy's heartbeat, and the blue line is the Catherine's signal average EEG. Now, when Catherine was in a coherent state, basically, what you see is that her brain waves were synchronizing to his heart. It's kind of a complex-looking waveform. Just trust me, that's what that means. It really does. I mean, exact synchronization and a shift in waveform. So her, and this ends up being the alpha rhythm, by the way, but her brain waves were synchronizing to somebody 5 feet away. And that's pretty amazing, actually, that our physiology has that level of sensitivity. At these longer distances, it only happens, we've seen, when you're in a coherent state. So this is, I think, maybe one of the first measures, physiologically speaking, of empathy. Okay, again, take a whole hour to really go through this. Okay, now this is another study based on our work, but done independently in Singapore, actually, where this guy took about 40 people in groups of 4 around a table, monitoring their physiology. So this guy down here, he didn't have a clue what's going on. He's naive, right? Just wired up, and I forget what they told him. These 3 people got some basic training in how to shift into a heart coherent state. So they were randomly signaled of when to shift into coherence. Okay, again, this guy has no idea what's going on. Kind of a complex protocol. It was very well done study. What he found was that when the idea was, if these guys are coherent, does it have a measurable effect on this guy? And what do you think the answer was? Yes, yes, absolutely. So when we're coherent, if one of our friends, colleagues, whatever is having a hard time, one of the best things we can do to help them is maintain our own coherent state. Not be sympathy, not over-identified, not over-caring, but actually maintain our own composure, our own coherence. That creates a field environment, at least gives them the potential, you can't make them do anything, to come back to regain their composure and their coherence. So it's really neat when the experiments actually proves this stuff, even though we all intuitively know it. Now, there was more to this study. When we looked at all the pairwise connections, there was a literal synchronization between heart rhythms. A very complex thing of rhythm shifting around the 4 people that had its own rhythm to it, which actually implies a group level field connecting everybody. So another study waiting to happen, actually, to take that its next step. Okay, non-locality. In fact, I added this slide this morning after seeing your talk on non-locality. Some of you probably know Cleve Baxter's work. Secret Life of Plants was written about him in the 80s, and his more recent book, Primary Perception. Anyway, Cleve's been a good friend for many years and hangs out in our lab a lot, or used to. He's getting not so able to get around these days. But anyway, he taught me how to do this and all the plant experiments, which we duplicated. So basically here, I've heard about these experiments, but could never find the data to really prove it. Myself just heard, anecdotal stuff. So we tried it ourselves. So here we're taking a person's own cells, oral leukocytes, immune cells in this case, extract them, put them in a test tube, and we electrode the cells in the lab. Meanwhile, the person the cells are from, they're 10 miles away. And this particular person had to go have a minor surgery done the day we decided to do this. So we're recording the cells, and she's got a synchronized watch to the lab clock and a little log to write down any significant events that go on. And there's a whole long recording. I'm just going to show you a couple here. So here's where she's waiting in the doctor's office. And then the nurse comes and says, okay, time for you to come in. So she writes, she had knowing that she's going to go in and have this procedure. So exactly in time with her log entry, we get a nice big response in the cells back in the lab. Wow. Okay. Now, she's going through the procedure. And this is the way she explained this to me. The doctor then said, oh, do you want to see this cyst I just cut out of you? Yeah, sure, doc. See the way she explained it. I wish I hadn't have said yes. Here's our log entry, the dotted line. Here's the cell response back in the laboratory. And it goes on like this. But just to make the point. So they're 10 miles away. Right, now, if this was happening all the time randomly, yeah, so what? But it's not. The amount of the synchronicity that was going on was really kind of amazing. Okay, so non-locality. All right, so basically, HeartMath tools, based on a lot of the research we've done, have developed a whole system of self-regulation. I love what you had said this morning about you got to do something. Right? You have to take self-responsibility for your own energies. And that's really what our tools and techniques are really about, and all the programs that have been developed from it. So basically, they're techniques that allow us to shift into a coherent state, both physically, mentally, and emotionally, so that we have more mental acuity, more clarity about things. We start making better choices, able to tap into that high-speed intuitive intelligence. So we're bringing more of that into our day-to-day decisions. But that takes energy. You got to do something about it, okay? And that can be facilitated with a technology that I'll talk about in a second. So here's just a few of the techniques: heart-focused breathing, heart lock-in, inner ease, quick coherence, freeze frame, which is a decision-making tool, attitude breathing, and so on. These are all very specific tools, techniques, very simple to learn. There's versions for kids. We have programs starting for preschool-age children. We are working with almost all branches of the military now. So it's the way we're able to package this. It takes it out of spirituality and makes it very practical. But yet it's spiritual because we're connecting them with their intuition, and we start making better choices and having transformational experiences. The M-Wave, I was going to do a demo, but we really don't have time. I'm going to go over time as it is. It's a really neat little inexpensive device that allows you to measure your own heart rate variability in real time, actually see your own heart rhythm patterns. And as you practice these techniques, am I really shifting into a coherent state? So you start learning what it feels like. And then as you practice, that's how you start maintaining longer periods of being in a coherent state, is how you start shifting your baseline. So it becomes the new familiar. And that's what it takes to overcome the neural patterns that most all of us live from and react from. You know, most of what we do is based on hand-me-down patterns that we have, instead of from a more intelligent and a reference point. So anyway, it's a device that helps facilitate skill acquisition. Really that simple. And anyway, it makes it kind of fun. Has games you can play that are controlled by your coherence levels and kind of neat stuff like that. So so for example, it's used in many, many schools now. Some of the more enlightened teachers, instead of putting a student on timeout if they misbehave, go sit in the corner, right? What's that child likely doing? Grumbling, hating the teacher for doing all that. All they're doing is reinforcing that neural pattern at a deeper level. Whereas if they say, okay, go get on the M-Wave device and play the game, and you can come back to class when you make the bunny kiss the deer in one of the games. They have to make a real shift into coherence to activate a positive feeling. So what a different approach that is. Follow what I'm saying? So now you're reinforcing something that's really going to help that kid. I don't think there's any greater gift you can give to a child than that kind of stuff. Or adult, but you know. Okay. All right, so there's a number of programs that are available at HeartMath through the nonprofit, which I'm with. As the research and education side, we have programs for teachers and educators, communities. We focus mostly on community building. So we have programs for police, fire, any kind of government agency, you know, the state social service agencies, things like that. And anybody can get, well, not anybody, but anybody qualified can get certified in these programs to deliver them in the community. De-stress workshop, which is basically you can deliver for free through universities, vet centers, so on. And a healthcare professional program called HeartMath Interventions if you're in clinical practice of any kind. So, all right, now I'm going to shift into a whole other topic. So I was going to throw a lot at you today. This is called the Global Coherence Initiative, which is an outgrowth. It's really part of our research out of the Institute of HeartMath, and it's branded separately because it allows us a place we can talk with a little wider voice about what's really going on at the energetic level. Through the Institute of HeartMath, we have to be a little bit more conservative because we do work with the military, schools, and so on. It only takes one certain statement, and you've got the fundamentalists, you know, blowing a whole program for a whole school system. So anyway, we can't be quite as honest there as we can on GCI. But basically, this is a science-based, co-creative project to unite people in heart-focused care and intention, to really facilitate the shift in global consciousness from instability and discord to more balance, more cooperation, collaboration, and enduring peace. So this is a comment here, a very sort of scrunched down statement from a guy named Franz Hallberg. Okay, and that basically, it's become increasingly clear that invisible magnetic influences from the sun and earth affect life from birth to death. So Franz Hallberg, is that a name that anybody of you ever heard of in here? I'd be surprised. How many of you have heard of circadian rhythms? Franz is literally the man who coined the term circadian rhythms in 1948. He's still with us. He's 93, just turned 93 last month. He goes to work 7 days a week. Really does. Has a whole floor at the University of Minnesota, the Hallberg Chronobiology Center. And most of the things we've come to learn about melatonin rhythms and sleep, that's all from Franz's work. Very, very famous man in medicine. He's actually on our board, and we're co-publishing some papers and things together now on this subject. So anyway, rhythms in the Earth's energetic fields, and I'll explain exactly what I mean by that in a minute. Lots of research. In fact, I've got a stack about literally this high of research papers. It's not a hypothesis. We are affected by changes in the Earth's magnetic fields. Things like the activity in our brain and nervous system, how well we perform on tasks, sporting tasks, and things like that. Blood pressure, heart rate, hormones. In fact, for a lot of people, literally our heart rate and blood pressure rhythms are synchronized to external rhythms in the Earth's magnetic field. I mean, some of this isn't so subtle. The number of traffic accidents, violations, number of tickets that get written, all kind of ride along and modulate with these rhythms in the Earth's fields. A wide range of health issues, hospital admissions for depression, strokes, a lot of forms of heart disease. Societal conflicts, criminal activity, even terrorism correlates with these fields. Interesting, and especially to us, is that of all the physiological signals looked at so far, the most reflective of changes in Earth scale geomagnetic activity is actually changes in our heart rate variability, the human heart, the heart rhythm. And that's also from Dr. Hallberg's work, even though we're doing a much larger study right now, currently going on to look into that. So at GCI, some of our research focus going on right now are looking at the effects of changes in geomagnetic and ionospheric fields on human health and behavior. We're looking at correlations between changes in these solar ionospheric fields and major human events, and the interconnectedness between collective human emotions and the Earth's energetic systems. The big ones at the bottom was kind of a tall order, but we're just crazy enough to think we can maybe investigate that. So many cultures, historically speaking, have felt that humanity was influenced in some rather important ways by solar activity, by the sun. Certainly the Mayans and the whole 2012 prophecies and all that now. But the Chinese, the Islamic cultures all had these understandings. At least this time around, the first modern person to really look into this is this fellow here, Alexander Chesovsky, who's a Russian astrophysicist. And he got drafted into World War I. And being an astrophysicist, he kept an eye on what was going on with the sun. And he noticed that during the war that it seemed like battles were just a little bit bloodier and crazier when the solar activity was kicked up. That got him intrigued. And it's amazing what some of these guys did back then, before we had internets and things. I mean, it's really impressive. I've actually been reading a lot of his original work, translations of it. So he did an exhaustive history, a study of history back to 1749, which is how far back we have data on solar cycles. And a very detailed thing. It wasn't rounded off. The type of event and rated the events and all this kind of stuff. I'm not going to go into all that. He ended up creating what he called the Index of Mass Human Excitability. The next slide I'm going to show you is his original data. Okay? The blue line on top, starting back at 1749 and continuing here to 1926 when it was first published, is the plot of each year the number of major human events. Major human event being the start of a war, major war, a revolution, major scientific discovery that had global implications and so on. Big stuff, okay? The red line on the bottom is the solar cycle. You think there might be a correlation here. Okay. Of course, I'm sorry? Yeah, this has been extended to modern times. Yeah, and verified by many people and so on and so on. It's very real. Economic cycles also modulate with it and so on. I just like showing the father of it, the original data first. Okay, here's a couple of more recent cycles. 22 and 23. We're now in cycle 24. So right at the triangle is the center. was when Iraq invaded Kuwait, and we all know the play out of that right at the top of the cycle. 9/11, right on cue, the top of cycle 23, and we all know the consequences of that. Okay, now in cycle 24 was 2 years delayed. The sun took a 2-year time out over here. First time that's happened in hundreds of years. Nobody knows why. It just does it. Has its own intelligence, I guess. But anyway, with the pickup of 24, which we're well into now, we see the Arab Spring and the riots in Europe and so on, all right on cue with these pickups in the cycle 24. All right, however, yes, it is true that it's actually 80% is the real number. The onset of every war since recorded history, 80% of them happened at a very specific small phase of the solar cycle. I was doing a presentation in Saudi Arabia a while back, and they said, why don't we just lock up all the politicians when it gets to that phase? Great idea. I wish we could. I think it would be a great solution. Anyway, that's true. However, and the media loves, even when they talk about this stuff, which is pretty rare, and the scientific community were just as guilty of focusing on the negative. However, the greatest periods of human flourishing follow these same cycles. This is really important. I can't underline this enough. Think of them as energetic influxes, right? And we have the choice of how we use that energy. Unfortunately, for most humans on the planet who aren't caring about self-regulation, right, managing themselves, being self-responsible, the way it hits us is in our emotional body. Very clear, actually, lots of studies. In fact, we did a study with 1,600 people, participants in GCI. And we, for 6 months, mailed them randomly these little surveys they filled out. And we had a direct correlation between a lot of this geomagnetic and solar activity and their level of mental confusion, their frustration, impatience, weird dreams, about fatigue and anxiety, and so on. Some really interesting stuff that came out of this. So, am I making sense? So if you think about it, one of the things that humans do not do well with is change. We don't like change. And we especially don't like unexpected change. Very stressful for most people. Yeah, if you think about it, if you were at a party and somebody slipped a drug in your drink of some kind and you started feeling the effects of that, you'd be pretty freaked out, wouldn't you? Yep. But if somebody told you that they had done that, it wouldn't be so bad. You still may not like it, right? But at least you know what's going on. Make sense? So this is what's going on globally with humanity. We have these energetic influxes and people don't understand it. Right? They're affecting us. And we don't do so well, and we get frustrated, and we get quicker to get angry in traffic and with each other, and we start fights and so on. Okay, so it's a big energy suck. So more and more people, however, here's the good news, are realizing that these rhythms are natural cycles. They're not out to get us, right? But it really does, and especially right now, we got 7 billion people on the planet. It's really important that we understand they can be a huge add-on, but it still gets down to having to do something, to take self-responsibility for our own energy, and to manage our reactions and our emotions, to care more, to cooperate more. Make sense? Really does get down to that. And that's what the HeartMath tools are all about, is the how-to of how you do that. You still got to apply them. So part of the research side of GCI is listening in on the Earth's energetic systems. And what I mean by energetic systems, one is the geomagnetic field. Right? That's the thing our compasses tune into. So the geomagnetic field goes out into space many thousands of miles. It's basically a static or a stationary field in that the magnitude doesn't change much. Yeah, over eons and hundreds and thousands of years. But to our day-to-day lives, no. Don't worry about changes to the magnetic field. But the way you can think what does matter, and the magnetic field is absolutely critical for life on Earth. No magnetic field, we would not be here. I guarantee you. It's the shield, primary shield. Okay? How much called the solar wind. Now, if you think of these, what are called flux lines, these magnetic field lines, as guitar strings. Okay, they're not really literal strings, but this magnetic field lines are real particles going around them. As they interact with the solar wind, they get plucked and they vibrate. So even though the magnitude's not changing, they do get plucked and they vibrate and they have resonant frequencies. So just like a guitar string, depending upon how tightly stretched, and the length of it depends on its resonant frequency. So the solar wind is strong enough, and that's the stuff being spewed out by the sun, to keep it simple, is strong enough it compresses the Earth's magnetic field on the daytime side and stretches it out on the nighttime side. So the tension on the field lines is changing, and the resonant frequencies are changing. So if we measure one of the primary resonant frequencies of these, what are called structural field line resonances is the technical term, 0.1 hertz. Okay, then there's a whole range of them. 0.1 hertz, you may not remember this, is the same frequency as the human coherent heart frequency. Yes. You get what I'm saying? The Earth is singing away 24/7 the same frequency as the human cardiovascular system works. And one of the fundamental frequencies is the same as the human coherent heart rhythm. Okay? And these are quite high. These are not trivial magnetic fields. Okay, they're well into the range that has measurable biological effects. Okay, so that's one energetic system we're talking about. The other is the fields created in and between the Earth and the ionosphere. So if you're not familiar with the ionosphere, think of it like a giant soap bubble around the planet. Starts about 50 miles up from the surface and goes out to about 150, 200 miles, depending upon conditions. It's a plasma, highly ionized gas. Also necessary for life on Earth. The bottom of the ionosphere, more or less, is the ozone layer. I'll give you a reference there. And it's what shields us from a lot of the UV radiation and so on. It's also pretty important for life on Earth. So a lot of you probably heard of, being it's a plasma. Plasma responds to magnetic fields and electric fields and so on, very complex ways. So there are current flows that are set up in the ionosphere. There's a giant figure 8, global propagating figure 8, for example, ring currents around the equator and so on. Whenever you have a current flow, you create magnetic fields. Some of those fields are large enough they induce current flows into the surface of the Earth. So who's in between all that? We are, right. Okay, so also that's one level. I've heard about ham radio operators or amateurs who talk to somebody in Russia or China and so on. The way that works, quite literally, is you bounce your radio signal off the ionosphere, and it bounces over here on the other side of the planet. Radio waves won't go through the Earth. So the ionosphere reflects lower frequency radio waves. So this creates what's called a resonant chamber between the Earth and the ionosphere. So any frequencies, magnetic waves that are in resonance with that chamber become what are called globally propagating standing waves. Okay? Called Schumann Resonances, after Otto Schumann, who was a German researcher who first predicted them mathematically. They were not first experimentally measured until 1960. So this is not that long ago, actually, when you think about it. So the first frequency of the Schumann Resonances, 7.8 hertz. That sound familiar to anybody? Do you have any physiologists in here? Yeah.
Oh, no, not physiologists.
Well, it doesn't matter, but.
Ham radio. Yeah. Just above the ham radio frequency.
Okay, so, well, it's a little higher, a little lower than that. 7.8 hertz, not megahertz or kilohertz, but.
Oh, megahertz.
Yeah. Alpha rhythm.
Alpha.
Okay. It's low. It's called low alpha in the human brain. There are 8 primary Schumann resonances. They all overlap human brainwave frequencies. So does the story make more sense to you? So the Earth is singing away, same frequency as our heart, same frequency as our brain. Okay, so one of these squiggly lines is an EEG, right off the recorder of a person's brain waves. The other squiggly line is right out of one of our magnetometers, our Global Coherence Monitoring System sites. Which one's which? How many think the top is the Earth? Okay, you have to vote. All right, so everybody else thinks the bottom's the Earth?
Yes.
Uh-huh. No, I'm playing. The top one is the brainwave. The point is, I couldn't really tell you the difference. They're pretty much identical. Okay? So back to high school physics class or science class, the tuning forks.
Yeah.
You know, the example of resonance, you'd bang one fork and the other one magically starts vibrating in unison with it. Then that's resonance. Of course, in that case, with tuning forks, it's air molecules mediating the effect. But same thing happens. It's a fundamental thing we use in electronics, is resonance. Radio waves, magnetic waves, they do the same thing. So when you have two systems that operate at the same frequency, you have the capacity for energy and information exchange through resonance. Guess what? We are vibrating away our hearts and brains at the same resonant frequencies as the Earth. By the way, those tuning forks are highly coherent systems. A lot of times we forget to talk about that. Coherence enables resonance. If you decohere a tuning fork, it doesn't work anymore. So you have to have coherent systems for resonance to occur. Same with us. Okay, so the Global Coherence Monitoring System is will be a global network of very specially designed monitoring stations. These are magnetometers that are very different than the current magnetometers that are out there. I wish we did not have to do this ourselves. There are many magnetometers that measure the DC level of the magnetic field, but not the resonant frequencies, which are the ones that are biologically relevant. Kind of crazy to me. So currently we have a site. What's my next slide? Okay. There's operating sites that have been going on for a couple of years now. One in England, California at our site, and Saudi Arabia, our current sites. In the near months, well, actually next month, one's going in Canada. And then New Zealand and South Africa and Brazil are the next ones. Hopefully all within the next 6 months will be installed. So that gives us a globally connected system. So right now it's kind of like about 80 years ago was when the first researcher was sticking an electrode on a person's head. It was really true, about 80 years ago, first EEG. And wow, look, squiggly lines. And the squiggly line's different when they're awake and sleep. You know, and then the next advancement was 2 electrodes. 2 squiggly lines, and wow, they're different on the different sides of the head. We're at the 3 squiggly line level now for the planets, brain waves and heart rhythms. So the whole idea of 14 sites strategically located is just like you're doing an EEG. They're trying to get the whole Earth view, all synchronized in time, so we can get a much more in-depth view of what the Earth's doing.
So the Heart Math Institute is sponsoring all of that.
Yeah.
Stuff.
Yeah. Well, through our donors and things. Yeah. Yeah, this is all out of Institute of Heart Math. Okay, so this is what the monitoring site looks like at the Institute of Heart Math, the first one in Boulder Creek. The second one is in Saudi Arabia. And you see this big block wall. This is Dr. Abdullah. He runs a big cardiac hospital in Saudi Arabia, actually. Pretty famous guy. So we were planning to get the site installed, and he kept saying, we have to build this block wall. I'm going, no block wall. They're buried, not a problem. Yes, we need block wall. Never told me why. Finally, I surrendered. Okay, we'll build a block wall. Turns out the desert is full of free-ranging camels who like to rub on things and roll on things. So here's the site right over here. And anyway, hundreds of camels all over everywhere. He was right. We needed to build a wall. So this is what's called a spectrogram. It's where you get lots of data, 24 hours of data. So these are the Schumann resonances you see going. It's frequency on this axis, time, 24 hours here. And these are those structural field line resonances, the lower frequency stuff down here, the field line resonances you're seeing in here. Anyway, you can see lots of those. If you become a member, you can go to the website for GCL Coherence, by the way, and see real time what the Earth's energetic systems are doing. It's very dynamic. It's really amazing how dynamic the Earth's fields are. And you can click on any day and blow it up into a big diagram. So most people get, and I mean, some people argue the point that we're affected by the Earth's fields. Most reasonable people kind of get that, yeah, we're born into these fields, and it makes sense that we'd be affected by them. The data is pretty overwhelming if you are at all neutral. Where I can lose a few people is we're suggesting it works both ways. Not only are we affected by the Earth's fields, but collectively we impact the Earth's energetic systems. So that's our hypothesis. And again, we're crazy enough to think we can measure this. There is some indication that we may not be that nuts. Some of you probably know the Global Consciousness Project. This is, if you don't, it's a project that was started at Princeton University about 12 years ago. And the history that led to that, just to give you, if you're not familiar with this, it's a series of random number generators. There's actually about a 40-year history of some wacky physicists in secret and weekends and nights doing experiments in things like Lawrence Livermore and places like that, that discovered that strong human emotions would affect things that are supposed to be completely random, like the decay rates of nuclear isotopes, for example. Not mental thoughts, human emotion. Okay? So anyway, that kind of got out and verified enough. That led to this global network of random number devices that are globally distributed. Our lab's been part of it almost since the beginning. We're one of the sites for it. So this is the data from 9/11, during the terrorist attacks, which has been the largest effect on the global network. So basically, if it's random, it should be around 0. And what we see here is a large order, if you will, introduced into these random devices, about 3 hours before the first attack. Now, what's important to understand is this is a global network of these random devices, about 80 of them at a time. Random number generators spewing out very hardcore devices made to spew out random numbers. No order, no pattern. 3 hours before the first attack, the global network, not a single device, all of the network stopped being random. A small but measurable coherence or order was introduced into this network in all the devices at the same time. That's what a lot of people don't tell you about. This is the global output of the whole network. Okay, so it's a global field effect. And these random devices are basically quantum devices. Okay, so there's some type of quantum level interaction here. Nobody really understands it, but it's very clear that it's real. In fact, the statistics on it now are actually beat quantum physics statistics, like p to the minus 26 or something now. Okay, so that's one attack. Now, at the same time, this is the global magnetic field data. So when you watch the weather at night and you see the two satellite pictures, or the satellite pictures showing you the global cover, they come from these satellites, literally. There's one over the east coast and one over the west coast. They're geosynchronous satellites. They're 22,000 miles out in space. On those same satellites aren't just cameras, they also have magnetometers. They're looking at space weather and other things as well. So this is the magnetometer feed. We have direct feeds now into our lab. So the time between each vertical line here is 24 hours. So these are the days leading up to, exactly in time with the terrorist attacks, is a very unusual jump in straight up in the magnetic field intensity. That's very rare that you see that in the Earth scale magnetic fields. You do from time to time if you have a big solar storm hit or something, but it's pretty rare that you see that kind of a jump. Now look at the field data in the days following 9/11 and the days ahead. And remember what the emotional climate was like back then. Now, I can't say this proves anything. An N of 1 in science is never proof. But I should probably find somebody to run the probabilities of this actually happening in time with that, without a solar storm happening, which is actually what happened. I mean, it's pretty phenomenal. So, okay. So basically, what we're suggesting here is an intention from a coherent system, a coherent heart, goes out literally like a radio wave. And that resonates with and modulates the Earth's geomagnetic fields to create more coherence in the field environment. And then all other living systems are in that field environment, right? So this can be amplified. We can amplify these effects of what the experimental evidence suggests anyway, when we're in groups. But we have to like each other. It's true. If you look at almost all of the experiments that have been done, it drives me crazy. Like, when you've got synchronization between brain waves, between people, and all that, there's many, many things. It almost always works better if the people like each other. You almost always use couples or people that are bonded. And then they talk about it like it's a mental thing. It drives me nuts. They really do. If you read any of the studies, they all talk about it's the emotional bonding. But then you turn around in their theories and say, well, the mental field. No, it's the emotional fields that work on this stuff. Anyway, that creates what we call a self-reinforcing field of emotional energetics that amplifies and increases the beneficial effects. So if you're working, to give you an example, if you're working in a small group and you guys decide to take on this coherent stuff, you create a group field. So if one of you is having a hard time, you're still connected to that group field, so it's easier to get back to center. Make sense? and you're creating a stronger field environment.
Is that like Maharishi's experiment?
I don't think it's quite the same. Yeah, it is similar, yeah, where they showed peace, less crime and things like that in DC. It's similar, yeah. What we mean by coherence is very different than what they mean by coherence. We're talking about brainwave coherence. Yeah. Okay, so here's back to the global consciousness data. This is a somewhat recent Global Prayer Day, Global Peace Day, back in 2011. The blue line is the statistic line called z-scores. You don't need to worry about it. It should be around 0. If the red line goes above the blue line, it's a significant effect. So it's not just negative stuff. In fact, many, many studies have been done now with these kinds of global days of many different kinds of organizations. Hundreds, actually, now. That's why the statistics are so powerful. So one of my favorite things that Dr. Nelson, Roger Nelson, who's the head of this, we're very good friends, did is he took, at the time, this was about 2 years ago, he did this. At the time, he had 180 some official events. To be an official event, it has to be known ahead of time and predicted and blah, 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 all this rigorous scientific stuff. Anyway, he took several people to rate these events by their level of love and compassion. So Global Prayer Day, Global Peace Day, where you get a few 100,000 people participating, high in love and compassion. Super Bowl, not so much. Right? You got half for one, half for another. Terrorist attacks, things like that. Low, right? Anyway, they got analyzed, and he reanalyzed the data by the categories. Those high in love and compassion had a significantly greater impact on the global network than those in medium or low categories. It is a really cool finding. Okay? It makes sense if I connect the dots on what I've been saying today. When we're more compassionate, when we're more appreciative, more caring, that naturally brings our system into more coherence. Our heart is radiating a measurable, more coherent field. A more coherent field has a more capability to resonate and couple with the global field environment, which is what this system's measuring. Make sense? Okay, hope I can connect the dots. So basically, still got to do something. It all starts with the individual. We have to be self-responsible for our own energy. As we're more self-responsible, we're starting to make better choices, smarter choices, more aligned choices with our own higher capacities or higher selves. We're creating a field environment that makes it easier for others around us. As others start doing that, as we start working to creating more coherent classrooms, more coherent work environments, more coherent communities, now we're moving to social coherence. So as pockets of people around the planet are working to create more socially coherent classrooms, right, workplaces, and so on, eventually that moves to global coherence, right? Because we're starting to now create an amplified wave that creates a more coherent standing wave. So for the next ring of people who are ready in their level of consciousness to take the next step, it makes it easier for them. You're not going to affect people that they're not ready, but as more people come into sync, into coherence, you're further amplifying, further stabilizing that global field environment, making it easier for the next ring, and so on. Make sense? It's really kind of simple. So right now, would like to invite all of you to become members of the Global Coherence Initiative. This is a bit outdated. It's, I think, 90-some countries now that there are members, over 45,000 members. That's probably outdated now, too. One of the kind of neat things is we call it the Global Care Room. If you're a member and you sign in, a little dot shows up showing your IP address. So you get to see who all's doing the same thing with you at the same time. So then there's guided things of where the community is suggesting that they send some extra heart energy to help reduce human suffering in that particular area. Right now, I'm sure it's Colorado. But those kinds of things. So the Institute of Heart Math has a membership. You can be a free member if you're interested in the kind of research we're doing. It's heartmath.org, pretty simple, or glcoherence.org for the Global Coherence Initiative. So I really hope some of you will become members and participate, at least energetically, with us in the energetic radiations. So.